Welcome to Translation Confidential. This is Peter Argondizzo and Patrick Daley. Thank you for joining us for episode 129. And I feel like this episode, Patrick, is true to our namesake, right? It was kind of, we took the idea from Kitchen Confidential and Anthony Bourdain and said, well, hey, we're going to do Translation Confidential. We want to talk about the things that people don't talk about. I know we've done some episodes over our history on a few of these things, but we're going to cover some stuff today. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, I'd like to think of this one as our show title is basically the insider baseball that other providers may not want you to know about.
Exactly. Hoping to help the buyers get a little bit more informed so they can be better buyers. So, hey, let's start with some news. A little bit of news in the language industry. I think was 1 week ago today that basically everyone freaked out in our industry because the president declared English as the official language of the United States. On the surface of it, meh. There's like 30 other states. There's 30 states in the union that have the same thing. They've declared English as the official language. In fact, some of the states even have secondary official languages, which kind of makes sense. There's a lot of Spanish speakers in this country, obviously. But the big thing is that they revoked the Clinton order from 2000, which basically provided for federal funding, said any federal agency has to provide language access. So that's been revoked. Interestingly enough, some resources out there like lep.gov, limited English proficiency, lep.gov, pretty much is non-existent. So, kind of a big thing. And the thing that I worry about, Patrick, is that, is this setting precedent, right? Is this, the bottom line is depending on whose numbers you use, still about 8% of the US population that really has very limited skills in English. And those people still are going to live here. They're going to work here. They're going to, be in courts here. So I don't know what's changed.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think sometimes requiring federal agencies to do things is a good thing. Like language access to me is a good thing, so people can understand what they're reading and doing on a daily basis. I'm also super curious to see if anything at all takes shape in the terms of education and funding like that for LEP programs. I know that those are pretty prevalent across the U.S. of either English as a second language or limited English proficiency programs. So very curious to see what happens to those at the federal level, especially in terms of funding. Obviously, states can get their own funding, but kind of having the federal backing is obviously a little bit of gasoline on that fire to really accelerate those efforts. So curious to see kind of how this all plays out. Like you said, it's a big change, and I know there's certain language service providers who only do government work, so I'm sure they're the most affected and most worried about what's happening.
Yeah, and that's really the issue, Patrick. I want to make sure because I sort of seemed like unaffected. I'm unaffected in the sense what I'm saying is the problem is still here, right? So you can say whatever you want. You could say our official language is Swahili, but that doesn't change the fact that there are a whole lot of people that speak other languages that are still here and work and live and breathe here. And the problem still exists. It's a big deal for me. I mean, I feel like it's a step backward for language access and it's problematic. We could do a whole show on this. What I would encourage you to do, I was fortunate enough to be on the podcast with Slater this week. There was an emergency podcast on the order, and we go into it in great detail. Also, I think you'll see on our LinkedIn, we're reposting a link from a webinar I did with Christina Green from Green Linguistics a few years back. And she really frames out there are still some protections and it's under civil rights. So there's still some protections. I think at this point, it's kind of a wait and see thing. I feel like we're going to need to do a podcast on this in maybe a few weeks or a few months to kind of see where things settle out.
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be lots of legal proceedings that need to kind of shake themselves out before there's anything definite that comes out of this.
Yeah, absolutely. We could do a whole show on this. So let's get rolling. All right. Pricing isn't as transparent as you think. That's a good one. So what are we thinking there, Patrick?
Yeah, I think anyone who's bought translation has probably seen a proposal or quote from a provider at some point that just has one number. It says, here's how much your project costs. And I think that should raise some red flags. I think you should ask for whether it's an itemized list or kind of a breakdown of what percentage of your fees are going towards translators, towards editors, towards project management, towards desktop publishing, towards whatever it is. I think you should really insist on seeing where what steps, number one, are involved in your project, and two, what percentage of the budget is going towards each of those steps.
I would agree. I think this is going to only become a bigger problem as AI and machine translation becomes more prevalent. When you get just that, you're doing a 10 language project and you just get one number, you don't even get a per language breakdown, or you don't see what the reps and the matches are and the discounts. That's buyer beware for me. I think that, that's a place where some LSPs hide, and they hide margin there. I think as a buyer, you should demand a higher level of transparency.
Yeah, I think another thing that comes to mind with this one too is kind of you get what you pay for, in terms of you could be charged very different rates for just, I'll do finger quotes, translation, and that can mean a lot of different things. But I think another important thing to think about is most language service providers are set up where the translators are largely a freelance, so they charge similar rates to almost all of their clients. It's just, I think you get what you pay for, in terms of if you see a rate that's kind of a race to the bottom, I think you can kind of have the expectation of what you're getting versus kind of mid-tier versus premium tier. That's just kind of across the board, not even just translation, of you kind of get what you pay for.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because now there's so much different strata as well in machine translation, which is kind of our subsequent point. Machine translation isn't really created equally. I think buyers need to understand what is in machine translation and how it works. So these days there's multiple engines, and guess what? Not all engines are created equally across languages. In other words, Azure might be completely fine for Spanish, French, German, Italian, Dutch, Danish, Norwegian, but then there's probably better engines out there, say for Hindi or Japanese. And so you ask those questions. And also you ask, are we using a trained engine, or are we just using vanilla out of the box MT? There should be a slightly higher cost for trained engines because there's carrying costs with trained engines. There's work in creating them. So usually an agency might say, hey, you have X amount of units and segments in translation memory. Usually kind of the watermark for that is 10,000 segments. If you have at least 10,000 segments, you get a pretty good result by doing a trained engine. So, ask. And I think, gosh, right? I mean, the thing we talk about most often, Patrick, is communication, right? So just ask. If you don't understand a concept, or you want, hey, how does that work? Fill me in. Tell me what's going on with that. How does that work? So be aware of that strata inside of machine translation.
Yeah, I think too, I kind of liken it to, I think a lot of people are using some sort of AI tool in their work now, whether that's Gemini or ChatGPT or fill in the blank with Copilot or whatever. But I know I frequently use ChatGPT, and there's the free tier and then there's the paid tier. And the free tier is like, hey, we stopped scraping the internet on September of 2023 or whatever the date was. Our data is only accurate up until that point. But if you have the paid version, you get a lot more real-time access. So I think, like you said, there's definitely tiers in machine translation, especially like you said, depending on how much translation memory you have, that can make or break your MT engine.
And in all honesty, it's far more effective than anything AI can do. I mean, think of this. At least current state might be different in the future, but current state, if you train an engine, let's say you're a client that's been translating for 10 years, 20 years. I mean, we have some clients that have been with us 30 years, right? So they have significant translation memory, and that memory can turn into, we've talked about this in other shows, that trained engine can get you a blue score, or sort of a quality metric, into the low 90s, which is pretty equivalent to first pass human translation. But think of the investment that's involved with that, right? Now we're talking, that's probably 100,000 segments. If you've got 100,000 segments of human translation that you've paid for over the years, that automatically gets you to the right spot where you want to be. And the editing aspect, because usually you want to understand, is it just straight MT? Well, okay, well, that has a certain value, but it's not vetted by a human. So you want to ask questions about, okay, well, let's talk about the editing. And is it one human editor? Is it two human editors? Because I think that's really where, we're going to see movement is how much human involvement is in each project. I will tell you historically, and I know we're going to talk about this as well. Historically, there's agencies that have not been transparent about that. They're using machine translation on the first glance, and in some cases, they're using the free version and not the paid version. And remember, the paid version is where you get security. And they just wouldn't tell you. It's like, oh, yeah, that's what we did. And then they did a human editor. I think that approach today is fine, but you have to disclose it. It has to be in the project description.
Yeah, I think another point we hear a lot is buyers wanting to know who is doing their translation. And I think kind of the secret here is that your quote expert translator may not necessarily be an expert. I think a lot of times LSPs will kind of throw work over the fence and see who raises their hand first to take it, rather than really give that a thoughtful spin of what translator, what editor they should pair to that specific project. And I know something that you guys do very well is you have the RCP report with every project that says how many years of experience the translator has. But I know the PMs, that's kind of a first step of making sure that the subject matter of the content aligns to the translator or translators that are being assigned to that work.
Absolutely. I mean, that's a beef that I've talked about that I have with some of the larger agencies where, from an efficiency perspective, the way that they source projects is amazing. It's great. So what they do is you get a project, they essentially throw it over the fence, to use your words, Patrick, and it's a pool of 1,000 translators, and the first one to raise their hand or bid the lowest price gets the job without any oversight of what their qualifications are, or are they capable for the level of content or the type of content. And that's really important. I mean, this is really getting in the weeds, right? So the question you might ask a vendor, in this case translation provider, is, hey, how do you source translators for my project? Say you're a person that has technical material. What we're giving you is fairly technical. How do you do that? And one of the things that I'm very proud of is that the ops group, Kimberly and Valentina and Mike and the team leads and such, are very aware of what the translators specialize in. In our system where we match translators to a job, we can see, like, what do they specialize in. We have green, yellow, and red for ratings based on quality. The red ones are not in our system any longer. They're red. That means don't choose them. But it's based on quality assurance metrics. It's based on how timely they are. And then, we can hover and see what industries or what type of content they're specialists in. So we're not the only ones that have a system like that. But I would say buyer beware. There are a lot that don't. So really, really good point.
Yeah, I would say too, something to look for here as well is ISO certifications. I think those are pretty rigid protocols that your LSP has to follow, and they get audited on those on a yearly basis. So there's certain clauses in there that say minimum years of experience as a translator, minimum levels of education, and all of those things. So to be ISO certified, you have to then prove to your auditors that all of your translators are meeting all of those qualifications. So that's kind of another layer of security that ISO certified companies can give you.
Absolutely. And that's something that we work really hard on here at Argo Translation, is in terms of those ISO certifications. We just received another one. This is for the machine translation one. And so we have 4 ISO registrations, and it's a lot of work to maintain those and basically to comply. So we have systems in place to help us comply with the quality requirements for each standard. Super important.
Yeah, and I would say too, I think it's important to know that those ISO certifications or qualifications change. I feel like when I started in the translation industry, everyone was just all about 9001, and that was the only thing people really cared about. But in the last couple of years, there's been a translation specific ISO certification, and now there's a machine translation specific certification. I would say don't let those just kind of sit with your provider and gather dust. I'd say make sure they're keeping up on the industry trends of what the necessary certifications are.
And if you're ever curious, you can request their quality assurance manual. And if you review the quality assurance manual, you'll see how they do it. How, what's the secret in how they comply with those directives or those standards. Yeah, the 18587 is the one that we just received, which is for the post editing of machine translation output. So I'm really proud of our team, passed with flying colors.
I know the first time you get certified is always the most difficult because that's kind of the real test. And then, like you said, if you have those systems set up in place, in theory, those audits become easier and easier as the years go on because your systems are setting you up to pass every time.
And certainly that's the way we address it. Like we try to get benefit out of the various compliance efforts. So we have a lot of different reports and dashboards that measure those things, and they really do help us to be better. I know, again, another thing is a lot of other agencies is window dressing. And I even have some colleagues that are in manufacturing that, it's audit time for that month. Before the audit, they scramble and get crazy. And how do we get
Tell
all this
some
stuff
people to
together?
take some sick time.
Probably. But we do this in our everyday activities. So it's all built into our system. We're essentially, as some people say, we're doing ISO. I hate that term. I don't know. I'm not sure what that means. We do that as we comply with the standards as we're doing projects. We're collecting feedback. We're measuring our on-time performance. We're measuring quality assurance metrics on every job. So we do that as we go. So I like the next one, Patrick. Rush fees might not be necessary. So that's the thing that, like, sometimes as a buyer, I always tell buyers, don't use that word. It's just tell me when you need it. Because if you use that, oh gosh, I really do need this in a rush. I need this by, you're sort of tipping your hat that you're ready to pay more money.
Mm-hmm.
I would tell the buyers, just don't say that. Just say when you need it. All right, I've got this manual. I need it by the 13th. That's it.
Yeah, or I'm hoping to have it by the 13th or whatever it is, but just don't say like, oh, this is a rush job necessarily, because to your point, I think people will be like, cool, you said it, and now I'm going to charge you for it.
100%. So I think that's a really, really good point, Patrick. They aren't always necessary. We've even had situations where clients be like, well, I did this job in the past and you didn't charge me rush fees. Well, it is a very personal decision for the organization, right? Because they might have a big backlog, right? So if it, your job might be rush only because their production schedule is very, very jammed up in that given language or set of languages, or maybe the group that does the desktop publishing is really jammed up and that's the last step. So they need a couple extra days. So, again, communication, right? We've talked about this many times. Just be honest. Tell the folks when you need it. They'll give you a price for whatever is required to get it in that time frame. And by the way, if you do have flexibility, you can work from there and say, hey, what if I gave you a couple extra days? Would that assist on the pricing? And you can certainly do that. So that's another option.
Yeah, I think another kind of play as a buyer there too is say, okay, can you quote this at standard price and turnaround and then rush price and turnaround? You can kind of see that difference of what that rush fee is actually getting you. If you ask to have it quoted both ways, you can kind of see the differential and make that decision then if you really do need that rush fee as the buyer.
Absolutely. What's next, Patrick? What's the next one?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of combine two because they feel pretty similar to me, but our headlines for those are your translation could be resold and you may not own your translation. So to me, those are pretty similar. I think knowing if other clients of that language service provider have access to your translation memory is really important. And then also if the language service provider is repurposing that at all or reutilizing it. I know that's typically a concern in cloud-based translation management systems. It's like, okay, does my translation memory live by itself? Is it part of a giant pool of it? Like, how are you using my buyer translation memory is a great question to ask about that. But then even with kind of where AI models are going, we talked about kind of training machine translation engines. I think it's fair to ask, are you using my translation memory to train someone else's machine translation engine? And so again, it all comes down to kind of what happens with your translation memory after that project is done and is it being used elsewhere?
Really, really good points, Patrick. And at a bare minimum, agency should at least, there's a process you can use to anesthetize a translation memory. In other words, it'll take out personal information, or it'll take out copyrighted, names or products or whatever the case is. And at a minimum, an agency should be doing that if they're, say, pooling resources into, a larger trained engine, if you will. But yes, there are some agencies that do not silo their translation memory, because it kind of, on the surface, it sounds good, right? Like, all right, well, if I put all my medical device guys together, I get this monster, medical device translation memory that I can use. Or Or if I just put them all together, why not put them all together? Well, there's a lot of good reasons not to do that. Because remember, some companies have their own specific, let's call it terminology, slang, jargon, you name it. I mean, we do work for a very large retailer, and they write to I would say sort of a lower register of Spanish that's more common in the US. There's no reason why you would want to commingle that translation with other translation members. It's very specific to that client. So here as a group here at Argo, we silo everything by company. It's all siloed by company. But yeah, that ownership is important, right? We talked about that as well. Who owns the translation memory? Just ask. Make sure to ask.
Yeah, I think too another issue with combining all of the translation memories is you lose client preferences and client review feedback because it all just goes into the same place, and then client A doesn't have the same preferences as client B. So now what do you do? Would be my counter to kind of putting them all into one translation memory. I mean, we talk about it all the time. The translation memory is, as a buyer, is your most valuable asset of continuing to work with either a limited group of providers or just one provider. That's really what's going to save you money, time, and energy down the line. So making sure that that is as crystal clean as it can be would be my top concern as a buyer.
Well, and even a performance issue, because like for example, for us, right, we've been around for 30 years. Could you imagine if we had all of our translation in one memory? I mean, it probably wouldn't run. I mean, that's just the other thing is we have an option that we give our clients when they request it. A little bit of a subscription-based thing is they can do, TM search. So in other words, they can search their own translation memory for phrases they've already translated. Well, if we had that all the memory in one spot, first of all, now we're exposing information from other clients. That doesn't make any sense. And also, if you did a query, I mean, you'd find thousands and thousands of matches if you searched for a pretty basic term, right? Like the word print or something. So from a performance viewpoint, that's also really, really crazy. Our last point, Patrick, is quality assurance isn't always as rigorous as it sounds. Where did you want to take that discussion?
Yeah, I think that kind of ties into the first point we made about pricing maybe not being as transparent. I think process should be equally transparent. I know, I'm sure it's changed since I worked at Argo, but I know we had lots of steps of like, these are the things that are on every single project, whether it's project management, quality assurance, translation, editing, and there's a pretty hefty paragraph that goes with each one of those that says what that step of the process involves, who's doing that work, and all that kind of relevant information. So again, a smaller quote or a quote with more white space probably isn't going to be your friend in this scenario.
We still do it that way, Patrick. We still detail out every step. I think it's super, super important for transparency, right? Again, we talked about, you use the term white space, the white space quote, where basically it's, $100,000 project and there's 2 sentences describing what's happening. Here's your translation cost. Just ridiculous to me. Ridiculous. Some people will do more research and get more data on a $500 purchase of a piece of like a speaker, a portable speaker or something like that, and they'll do a $30,000 translation project and be okay with 1 sentence describing it. It doesn't make a lot of sense. But not all vendors are geared up for the transparency. So anyway, there's strata there. If they're completely abdicating to AI for quality assurance, well, I mean, you have to figure out what is that. That could be okay if maybe the workflow is translation, human review, and then maybe there's AI, or translation and human review, and then there's maybe some AI thing that looks for inconsistency, spelling, those sort of things. That's great. That's a great add-on. But let's just not do machine translation and AI enhanced QA, and that's it. That's it. I mean,
Yeah,
that's not applicable or not.
I mean, I
appropriate.
remember running QA checks myself within a translation management system, and there's certain things that obviously it is an automated check, right? It needs to be able to do the initial check without human intervention, but then I would look at the QA log and be like, oh, this one's actually not an issue for whatever reason. Like, you can be that human in the loop to kind of either say thumbs up, thumbs down to whatever the automated QA is flagging. I mean, I remember very vividly of, we'd get tags for superscripting text or anything like that, and certain languages don't have superscripts, so certain translators would leave those tags out, and that is just something you learn over time as you're doing enough QA checks. You go, okay, English to Chinese, like Chinese doesn't have superscripts, so those tags just don't apply to the translation.
Absolutely. And there are so many false positives. And now they introduce AI as well. You get AI hallucinations and they'll think of product names. Well, probably comes up as a misspelling until you add it to the term base and say, okay, this
Mhm.
is a term, this is a product name, this is what they use. So you have to do that work. So especially in the beginning stages, you're going to get a lot of false positives in QA. If you have that on full auto, you're going to get something pretty ridiculous.
Right. I mean, to me, it's a similar line of thought of training your AI model, right? You're training your QA processes. Like you said, it could be updating the term base or saying like, actually, no, this isn't a positive QA flag. So, I mean, same thing applies to me.
Absolutely. Well, we are at that point in the show, Mr. Daly, where we talk about our biggest takeaway. What's your biggest takeaway from today?
Yeah, I think I would definitely encourage buyers if you're evaluating multiple providers to ask a lot of questions and ask the same questions to all the providers that you're looking to work with. That will be very telling to see what kind of results you get back. I mean, I think that's fairly common in hiring people for positions at companies. The interview process, you want to ask the exact same questions so everyone's evaluated on the same things. I think the same thing applies to if you're putting out an RFP for a language service provider. Have them respond to it. Once you have questions, review everything again. Ask all the same questions to all of the providers, and it'll be very, very telling with what responses they come back with.
Yeah, I like that a lot, Patrick. Yeah, for me, my biggest takeaway is kind of more of a global one. Based on all these things that we described, it's certainly caveat emptor, it's buyer beware. And I think the only way to get to the proper scope of the project that you want, the proper services, is just to ask lots and lots and lots of questions, and hopefully your language service provider is transparent enough to answer those in the right way and help you with client education, so you just become a smarter and smarter buyer every time you do a project, which I think is really important. So wonderful. Well, for this episode of Translation Confidential, this is Peter and Patrick signing off.